Less than 2 months, the provincial election campaign will be in full gear. Door knockers will be pounding the pavement with candidates, party signs, and billboards that will dot neighborhoods and streets. Perhaps you're only seeing some of those billboards in your community. Well, today on Blue Sky, we're taking an early look at the October votes. A recent poll suggests a closer election than we've been used to in recent years. We want to hear from you too. Call in or email to join the conversation. What are your thoughts ahead of the campaign and what issues will be front of mind for you? Give us a call. Our number is 1-800-716-2221, or you can email us bluesky@cbc.ca. We would love to hear from you. Well, it's barbecue season, of course, football season, camping season, and campaign season. Yes, the leaders of Saskatchewan's political parties and their candidates are pounding the pavement this summer. Our first guest is always in campaign mode. Eric Grenier is the writer, publisher, and podcaster of The Writ. You can see his work at thewrit.ca on YouTube as well. Hi there, Eric.
Hi, Adam.
So, Eric, we're still, as I mentioned, about 2 months away from the vote here in Saskatchewan. As someone who monitors and analyzes this for a living, what intrigues you the most about the upcoming Saskatchewan election?
Well, it's probably that we don't really have a huge clue of what it's going to be like, because we haven't seen a lot of polls out of Saskatchewan. There was the one, as you mentioned, the Insightrix research poll that was just published over the last few weeks, or last few days, I should say. And it showed a really close race between the NDP and the Sask Party. It was a 1-point lead for the NDP across the province. In a province that went to the Sask Party by a margin of about 29 points in the last election, that is quite a swing. And for someone like me who follows the polls and follows the trends, I'd like to see some more numbers just to have a better clue of actually where things stand in the province. Because if it does stay like this, if it is actually neck and neck, boy, that's a tight election. That's going to be one heck of a campaign.
And you mentioned that Insightrix poll, and we covered it in the news about a week ago, and it was an online poll of just under 900 people that took part, and it found decided voters were split 47% in favor of the Sask Party, and what caught a lot of eyes, as you mentioned, was 48% in favor of the NDP, and that was among decided voters. Still a big chunk of people that were undecided. This got a bit of attention here, even though it's the middle of the summer and people maybe aren't thinking of the campaign. What was your reaction when you saw some of those numbers?
Well, it is the same kind of trends we saw from Insightrix a little earlier in the year. So at the very least, it does confirm that this is going to be a tight campaign. We had seen a poll from the Angus Reid Institute earlier this year, as it's been quite a while, showed that the Sask Party had a sizable lead, but that it was still a lot more competitive than we've seen in the province for a while. But when you look at the numbers, you go down into it a little bit more detail, you just see this rural-urban divide between support for the NDP in Regina and Saskatoon, and then support for the Sask Party in the rural parts of the province. It's more or less 2-to-1 NDP in the cities, 2-to-1 Sask Party in the rural areas. Will it end up being like that during an election campaign? I don't know, but it definitely shows that the province is divided, and it could come down to just a handful of seats. And if it does, then certainly this is going to be the tightest election we've seen since, what, probably 2003?
Yeah, that's right. We want to hear from you, listeners. Our number is 1-800-716-2221, or you can email bluesky@cbc.ca. Our guest right now is Eric Grenier of The Writ. This email is from Keith, and he says the Sask Party could run cardboard cutouts or even livestock in most of their ridings and still win, and that's tongue-in-cheek, of course. But I think, Eric, the point there is something that you touched on there, is just the huge gulf in the numbers in the last election. We know this in Saskatchewan, and as someone who covers provincial politics here at CBC, there's really two stories in this election. To me, it's what happens in the cities, and can the NDP make enough gains in Saskatoon, Regina, and even, let's say, Prince Albert, Moose Jaw, and what is the impact on the Saskatchewan Party vote in rural Saskatchewan? Because, as you mentioned, they have a stranglehold there, and the map favors them as well, right? The numbers, they don't need to win necessarily Saskatoon or Regina to still win the election.
Yeah, that's right. That's really what is the advantage that the Sask Party has, is that technically, without a single seat in Regina and Saskatoon, they could still form a government. And we know that from last election results, from the polls, that the margins in some of these rural seats are just so huge that it is just almost implausible to imagine that the NDP could win them. As you mentioned, they could maybe flip a few in Prince Albert and Moose Jaw, but even if they do that, they still need to more or less sweep the cities. And when you see the kind of numbers that we've seen in like the Insightrix poll, where the NDP had over 60% support in Regina and Saskatoon. Certainly, you can imagine that it is possible to see a sweep of either of those cities or both of them by the NDP. But even some of the, the outlying seats, the more suburban seats in both of those cities, they were still pretty big Sask Party margins, right? So is the NDP vote, if it is as high as we've seen in this poll, is it going to be just super concentrated in the downtown core of the two cities and a lot harder to flip those seats outside in the suburbs? Because for the Sask Party, it would take a disaster. It would take another party to come up and start getting 30, 40% of the vote in the rural areas, which we're not seeing, for them to really have be in any danger of losing any of those seats, aside from the two in the far north. So if you start out with 29 seats, 30 seats already in the bag, it's not hard to get to 31.
Let's talk about, the third parties, or the parties that are going to be running in this election, and they're going to have some candidates, at least by all indications. One of them that's perhaps getting the most attention is the Saskatchewan United Party. I know they're running a lot of billboards. They're very active on social media. They have a new leader, John Romick, who's was their biggest donor. He replaced Nadine Wilson, who's their only MLA who's sitting in the legislature. They haven't won a seat yet in an election or a by-election. How hard is it to judge, as someone who watches the polls, the impact of these third parties? Because I know from when I look at it, it's difficult to tell if they even register with voters.
Yeah, I think that's really the challenge here, because in the polling that we've seen, you do see higher support for quote unquote other parties, because often they're not defined in the polls, but you see that it's higher in the rural areas, sometimes as high as double digits. And we saw in the Lumsden-Morris by-election not too long ago that the Sask United Party was able to take a decent chunk of the vote. But even so, the Sask Party wasn't really in any danger of losing that seat. If a party like the Sask United Party, if the PCs, for example, they managed to get a decent amount of support in some of the by-elections as well, if they can get 10 to 20% of the vote, that's a decent performance for a party that doesn't have a real shot of forming government. But again, when the Sask Party had 60, 70% support, nearing 80% in some of these ridings, they can lose 20, 30, 40 points and they can still win, because the NDP then needs to get up to 30, 40% to have a chance of winning it. So it is really a two-party race. There might be a few of the third parties that could take a chunk of the vote here or there. I'd be surprised if after election night, we're looking at the results and we see more than 1-2 ridings at most where that extra vote made the difference. And that even assumes that some of those voters would have voted for one of the other parties. A lot of this vote is often a none of the above ballot. And if those parties didn't exist, those people might just stay home.
And we saw in 2020 with the Buffalo Party making some big inroads in the rural areas, finishing second in a handful of ridings. That caught a lot of eyes. That obviously caught the attention of the premier, who made remarks directly to those people that voted for that party on election night. The 2020 results, it seems so long ago, Eric, now, and there's so much turnover in the Saskatchewan Party, with a lot of their candidates not running again, a lot of their cabinet ministers, familiar names, not running again, a couple of just two NDP MLAs not running again. But what kind of thing, if anything, when in your experience of looking at elections, does turnover of candidates, does that make a big difference? Is it kind of an apples and oranges thing? Does it depend on the party? What do you make of that?
I think it often depends on the cycle, where it is in the cycle. Sask Party's been in since 2007. Some of the MLAs have been there for that long. So at some point, it's natural that you have a certain level of turnover. You see this with governments, usually when they're at the 10-year mark. When you see that happen with a government that's a little bit long in the tooth, it is often more of a reflection of people making personal choices in their lives that they want to, get out of politics after being in it for a while. If this was a first-term government or a second-term government, you're seeing a lot of people leave, then that is often a signal that, maybe they see the writing on the wall and they want to get out of there before they waste time on a campaign they might lose. I'm not sure if we're in that situation here, because the Sask Party, aside from the individual poll we've seen from Insightrix, some other surveys, is still the favorite to form government, I would say, at this stage. So if you're an MLA and you're stepping aside, it likely has much more to do with your own personal circumstances than what you believe is the fate of the government. In a close riding, when there's no incumbent, when that MLA steps aside, that can make a huge difference because it opens up people's options for voting. They're more likely to consider another candidate. In a riding that it isn't so close, usually doesn't make a big difference. It's usually considered that a candidate is worth somewhere around 5 points in terms of an election outcome. And there's not that many ridings that were that close. So it matters more. There's a few MLAs and cabinet ministers not running for re-election in Regina and Saskatoon, battlegrounds in the next election. Some of the MLAs who are stepping aside in the rural areas, probably not going to cost the Sask Party that much.
We want to hear from you today. Our guest is Eric Grenier with the Ritz and breaking down the Saskatchewan election, still a couple of months away from that, but always campaign mode here in the province. Our number is 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Is there an election issue that you think should be on the lips of the leaders, the candidates in your area? What are you focusing on as we get a little bit closer to this fall vote? Eric, you talked about, and we briefly mentioned the results from 4 years ago. Since then, there's been some changes to the electoral boundaries. We're not going to get too in the weeds about it, but what are your thoughts on how that may play out? Is anything shifting based on, in your read, based on how the map has been redrawn?
I don't think so. When I was looking at some of the results the last time and how it plays out on the new map, not a huge amount of difference. I don't think it's going to have a big impact on the election. There could be a few ridings if it comes down to 1, 2, 3 points. That maybe the fact that some voters have find themselves in an NDP leaning riding versus a Sask Party riding, that might make the difference. But it was actually something I was surprised to see, because often you do see when there is a new electoral map, it does have an impact in at least a handful of ridings. But in this election, it probably won't have much of an impact on the outcome. It does have an impact on where some of the MLAs have decided to run. We've seen that in a couple of cases where they had to make a choice between running in one riding or another. But in terms of, if it comes down to a single seat and 2 seats in the election, even then, I would be shocked if it was the electoral map that made the difference.
It's really interesting because when you look into some of this, and for me and for yourself who looks into this and has to report on it, I'm going to have to learn a few new riding names, constituency names to remember who's running where. I know that a few times when the map was done, a few of the candidates and a few of the MLAs who are running again were going, now I'm representing like a different neighborhood or a different area. I have to get to know those people a little bit. So that's something that should be interesting to see how that plays out. Of course, you cover elections across the country, by-elections, the federal campaign. Eric, we don't have a federal election date yet, but speaking of campaigning, it seems like that's kind of a never-ending campaign that's happening right now. What impact does federal politics have at the provincial level when you look at this?
It has an enormous impact. It doesn't always, but it does feel like most of the provincial politics we've seen, or a lot of them that we've seen across the country over the last little while, are federal campaigns in proxy. Every premier who is of a conservative bent would prefer to run against Justin Trudeau than their own local opposition leader, I think. And we're seeing that. We see that in New Brunswick, which is also going to the polls in October. We see this in British Columbia, where the NDP is the government there, and the opposition Conservatives and the BC United. It's complicated, but they're trying to make David Eby there almost an NDP coalition person with Justin Trudeau. And you see the same thing in Saskatchewan. It's a lot easier to run against an unpopular prime minister than it is against an opposition leader who, we've seen in some of the polling, Carla Beck polls moderately well. She's more popular than Justin Trudeau, I would say, in Saskatchewan, although that's not a very high bar to cross. But we do see that impact is huge. And there's even some calculations from Doug Ford in Ontario, Tim Houston in Nova Scotia, that maybe they'd like to have an early election campaign to make sure that Justin Trudeau is still in place in Ottawa when their province goes to the polls. So I wouldn't be surprised if Justin Trudeau is one of the words we hear out of Scott Moe's mouth the most over the next few months. Yeah,
as someone who covers the legislature full time, I can tell you that in question period, the name Trudeau, saying those come up frequently, and as you mentioned, wanting to run against the federal leaders rather than the person that they're running against in the province, that definitely plays out. And it's also something I think we saw, and you'll know this, in Manitoba with some of the ads in Alberta. In recent elections where, Mr. Singh, Mr. Trudeau were part of the sort of anti-NDP advertising put on by the Conservative parties there. Speaking of the Conservative Party candidate, Pierre Poilievre, is polling quite well, let's say. And he was the keynote speaker at a fairly recent Saskatchewan Party convention, which is kind of the first time that I can recall. I think it's the first time ever that they've had a federal Conservative leader take that kind of high-profile position at a convention. What do you make of how maybe Scott Moe is going to try and ride the Pierre Poilievre wave?
Yeah, I don't think he's the only one. There's a lot of conservative politicians across the country that would like to do that. Because if you look at where the polls are right now, I wouldn't be surprised if the Conservatives reach 70% support in Saskatchewan in the next election. A rate of support that the Sask Party is probably not going to be able to achieve. So there is some coattails there. There is going to be ad spending that we've seen from Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. Recently, they've been going after Jagmeet Singh and the NDP. Probably not going to hurt if the Sask Party piggybacks a little bit on that by trying to tie Carla Beck to Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau. So right now, Poilievre is leading in the polls anywhere from 15 to 20 points across the country. Very likely, if these trends hold on, that they would form a majority government, and a huge one. And not, being in the good books of Pierre Poilievre is probably not a bad idea if you're a conservative politician. You share a lot of the same voters, share a lot of the same donors, share a lot of the same members and volunteers. In a place like Saskatchewan, the two parties are going to be very, very, very closely tied.
You mentioned there are elections happening in BC this year, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan. You're going to be a busy guy, as always. It's kind of a crazy October. I hope you're going to have some rest and maybe a holiday in September before. What similarities or differences do you see between, I think you touched on a little bit as far as the strategy of let's say, the Conservative parties in those provinces trying to tie the leader of the NDP or who it may be to Justin Trudeau, to Jagmeet Singh. What are some of the things similar threads you see happening in those provinces? Are they different? Are we seeing a very close race in a couple of those provinces? Educate some of our listeners on what's happening in New Brunswick and BC compared to Saskatchewan.
I think there's a couple of common threads. One is, as you mentioned, the attempt to try to tie either the opposition or the government to Justin Trudeau. We're seeing that in British Columbia with David Eby trying to make the NDP, trying to tie the fact that the Liberals and the NDP have an agreement at the federal level. That means the NDP at the provincial level is tied to Justin Trudeau. In New Brunswick, where it's the Progressive Conservatives, Blaine Higgs, who's the premier, trying to tie Susan Holt, the leader of the Liberals there, with Justin Trudeau. It's a Liberal brand. It's probably the only Liberal party right now that is doing okay in the polls. So we do see that common thread. But the other one is, these are all incumbents that are in a little bit of difficulty. You see this with Scott Moe, who is still probably polling a lot better than I would say David Eby and Blaine Higgs. But again, feeling the pressure from the opposition. We see this in British Columbia, where David Eby and the New Democrats feeling pressure from the rising BC Conservative Party. Conservative Party in British Columbia before this year was a little like the PCs in Saskatchewan, a fringe party that managed maybe 1%, 2%, 3% of the vote. But there was, it's a long story, but there was the BC Liberal Party, which was a centrist conservative party. They decided to change their brand to BC United. Their brand tanked after that, and now the BC Conservatives are chasing David Eby in the polls. And again, it's this anti-incumbency mood. And you see this in New Brunswick because the PCs have been in power there since 2018. The Liberals are doing all right in the polls because the Higgs government has been there for so long. You see the same pressures on housing, inflation, healthcare. These are kind of the decisive issues in every province and every election right now, and probably the next federal election as well. So you do see these common threads that incumbents are in trouble, and try to blame Justin Trudeau if you can.
And Eric, we're talking Saskatchewan provincial politics, the upcoming election. Give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca to join the conversation. Tell us what issues you may think are top of mind for you on the doorstep. What do you think of the recent poll that suggests that the NDP are neck and neck among decided voters with the Saskatchewan Party, which would be a departure from what we've seen in the past? Eric, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you about what we're seeing in the U.S. and how closely you monitor that. And I know you're focused on Canadian politics and polls here, but you must, I know you're a political junkie, you must have some thoughts on what's happening there and specifically the polling. What do you make of, let's say, what the crazy change in Kamala Harris going to become the Democratic nominee, and then how that may impact what we see in Canada?
Yeah, it's really remarkable because really in the last month, 3 weeks, it's gone from an inevitable Donald Trump victory after the assassination attempt. A lot of the commentary at the time was that he was now going to be on track to win the election with Joe Biden, who seemed like he was not going to lead, that people were not willing to vote for someone that was seemingly that impacted by his advancing age. Kamala Harris comes in. The polls start to swing, and now Kamala Harris is leading in most of the toss-up states, those swing states. She's now ahead of Donald Trump in the polls, whereas Joe Biden was behind. Some of those states that are going to be key in the next election, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the Democrats are now leading in them. It is a remarkable shift in voting intentions in a country that has very, very polarized politics, not a lot of undecided voters. It's not like here in Canada. People don't move around as much as they do here. Elections can be decided. Campaigns matter in Canada. The United States, campaigns about a year long, and usually by September, October, the outcome is already pretty much preordained. But it's been a big shift. The question is going to be whether Kamala Harris and the Democrats are going to be able to maintain this momentum for another nearly 3 months. Whether impact it's going to have on the next election, it's going to have a big one, because I think that especially the federal Liberals were in a way expecting that if Donald Trump won the election, it might help give them a boost, might help spook Canadians into not wanting to vote for a Conservative Party. If instead Donald Trump does not win the next election, and U.S. politics does not become a big issue in the next campaign, well, then it's going to become a referendum just on Justin Trudeau, and the politics south of the border is going to be, not going to be a big issue. Right now, it's the only thing we're going to be talking about for the next few weeks. I dare say maybe even in Saskatchewan.
Yes, I think you're right. It's fascinating, Eric. Thanks so much for all your expertise and time today. We really appreciate it, as always. And to let people give you a plug as well, I'll be a guest on Eric's video at the RIT in a couple of days here. We're going to chat about Saskatchewan politics, so definitely check that out on YouTube. Eric, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, thank you.
I'm Adam Hunter in for Alicia Grabinski this week. This email comes from Gerald from Chaplin. He says, since the Saskatchewan Party has a 29-seat head start with rural ridings, bold prediction, 29 Saskatchewan Party, 28 NDP with Saskatoon and Regina and 2 northern seats. The election will then come down to Moose Jaw in Prince Albert. Wouldn't that be fascinating? As someone who covers the province and covers the election, it would be very exciting, but you never know. So thanks, Gerald from Chaplin, for that email. Now, we mentioned earlier in the show a recent poll done by Insightrix here in Saskatchewan, and it showed that the NDP is ahead of the Saskatchewan Party by 1 percentage point among decided voters. To break down the results a bit more, here's Lang McGilp from Insightrix.
Females tend to favor slightly towards the Saskatchewan NDP, whereas males tend to lean a little bit more towards the Sask Party. That's coming through here as well, where there is over 50% of each of those groups favoring that party. We also notice age-wise that younger audiences or residents tend to are more likely to support the Saskatchewan NDP, and as people age, they tend to be more likely to support the Sask Party. So that's also showing through in our results here. Where we see the big difference, though, is in the region. Compared to some of our more recent elections in Saskatchewan, we are seeing a little bit of a greater polarization happening between Regina and Saskatoon, having a much stronger support for the NDP, whereas the rural areas having stronger support for the Saskatchewan Party, which may not necessarily be a surprise to people, but we're definitely seeing, I think, a little bit more of a pronounced shift in that way.
That was Lang McGilp from Insightrix, a Saskatoon-based market research firm, to dive into the provincial vote and the results of that poll and what it may suggest. We're joined by Daniel Westlake. He's assistant professor of political studies at the University of Saskatchewan. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So, Daniel, I know you've seen this poll and the results, and we just heard a bit of an explanation there, diving a little bit deeper into it from Lang McGilp from Insightrix. What was your reaction?
Yeah, so it's a curious poll. It's a similar result to the one that Insightrix got the last time they were in the field. And it is interesting to me that when Insightrix had their last poll up, not this current one, Angus Reid had a poll around the similar time that had the Sask Party up by about 10 points. It's not unusual to see different firms end up with different results. But the question that I have going forward is, okay, if Insightrix now has a close race, are we going to see other polling firms end up with similar types of results, or are other polling firms going to show a fairly comfortable Sask Party lead? As always with polls, you've got to be very careful about reading too much into singular polls. There are outliers that sometimes exist, not through any fault of the pollster, and sometimes different choices in methodology can lead to slightly different results because some pollsters reach some voters and might have trouble reaching others. So my first instinct is, okay, we've got one pollster that's now showing a consistent close race. What are other pollsters showing?
What do you make of that discrepancy then between the Insightrix results and the Angus Reid result?
It could be a methodological issue, and not necessarily that one is doing has problematic methods and the other doesn't. Different methodological choices will reach certain voters. Sometimes you reach people who are more educated, or one pollster will reach voters who are more trusting, and another pollster choosing a different method ends up having trouble reaching those same groups of voters, and that can lead to somewhat different results across polls. It's concerning at a time when I think polling is becoming more difficult, when response rates are increasingly low. I think it is more challenging to get representative samples, and so slight difference in methodology can lead to samples that are not representative in different ways, and it's really hard to know before the election happens, if you've got a discrepancy like this, which pollster's method is right, so to speak, and which pollsters got their method somewhat off.
Daniel, we're going to pause with you just for a second to take a call. It's James in Saskatoon. Hi there, James.
Hey, how's it going there today? Yeah, no, I agree 100% with that statement, and that's why I was calling in. I think that there is a significant draw against the methodology that's employed by Insightrix. And if, for example, I look at one of the CBC's colleagues, Janet Brown, that is utilized in Alberta, and you notice the difference in how that showcases a different perspective. I think it really does speak to the underlying issue because of how you reach the potential voters, right? And there is a inherent constituency of people that are reluctant to give honest answers, right? And so when we take the complexities of all of that aspect, and then further to that, we look at how just lay the overlay of how is it that in Saskatchewan we have 14 MPs that are of a conservative bent, but yet in the province there isn't that other representation. So to be sure, like we can see that the NDP has had some connection with some of the labor troubles that their partner associations, be it the unions, have created, if you will, right? And so there has been a little bit of an outrage from that. But even as those are settling themselves out, where is the rest of the public? And I think, yes, it is not unheard of to think that that there's a view that we want an election that represents some of the new directions that are coming forward. But I think overall, it's really hard to change a voter's muscle memory, right? So even though if you have been a longtime Sask Party supporter, for you to go into the booth and actually vote for another party, namely the NDP, we've seen in time and time again in different research documents and polling research that just doesn't happen, right? So there's one thing to show a level of frustration, and I think that that message is certainly somewhat there. But in the same token, the reality of us having some major overthrow of political change, I think it's a lot of wishful thinking.
James, thanks so much for your thoughts and your call today. We appreciate it.
You have a great day. All the best to you.
And Daniel, what do you make of that? James made a couple of points there. I wanted to highlight one on people maybe not giving their true thoughts or maybe not wanting to weigh in on certain polls, and just the struggle that some may have changing their vote, that maybe they'll just stay away if they're not satisfied with the current government.
So I think I think this is important. We've got two polls here showing different results. We don't know which method makes most sense and which method is closer to the truth. So it could be that Insightrix is off. It could be that the Angus Reid polls that were done earlier in the year that are off. And I mean, with just two pollsters, there's no real way of knowing kind of which is the outlier or which one is different. I'd be curious to see if Angus Reid keeps coming up with significant Sask Party leads. So let's be very, very careful when we see polls that are showing different results, not to pick the poll that we like better or the poll that produces the result that we think is more in line with what we expect to happen. You've got two pollsters showing different results. It's an indication that there's a lot of uncertainty. There's an indication that probably choice of method and perhaps very nuanced choices in method can matter. But that doesn't mean one's right or wrong, or it doesn't mean that we know which one is necessarily right or wrong. The other thing that I might just say, just with respect to muscle memory, there are kind of partisan voters who continue to vote for kind of the same party, but vote switching is also a thing. And I mean, we should expect in any given election that some voters are going to switch from one party to the other. I don't think we would expect, and previous vote obviously is predictive of future vote, but some voters are going to change their minds based on the economy, based on what they think around teachers' unions or any given issues that happen to matter in a particular election. So we shouldn't necessarily discount the idea that voters might switch their views, or at least some might.
Yeah, we wanted to check in with Rhonda, who's on the line here from Regina. Hi, Rhonda.
Oh, hi, Adam. Yeah, I wanted to call in. I don't know if my thoughts are correct, but I was thinking for those living in the rural areas, or ideally, I'll put it that way, there could be more education somehow, because I think that if you are living in a rural area and therefore not exposed to the daily exposure, I live in downtown Regina, so that's more my case, to things like homelessness, people that are have been evicted because they can't afford the rent or have trauma in their lives, whatever has precipitated that homelessness, poverty, other issues that cities deal with. And perhaps that could influence rural areas in terms of their understanding and, what is needed, what's not being addressed, and so on. And I don't know whether that could have some bearing on, on what your vote is going to be. I mean, it's great if you're in the rural areas and you have such support from the Sask Party, but whether there is a need for broader education, which to me indicates, the fact that NDP is stronger in the cities, and of course the Sask Party is stronger in the rural areas. So that's my thoughts on that.
Thanks, Rhonda. I know, Daniel, you and I have talked about this in the past, and it was something that Eric touched on as well, and that we saw it in the Insightrix poll, whether, we were talking about, taking those polls with a grain of salt. There is a split in Saskatchewan. We know that, in rural and in the cities. What do you make of, the divide, let's say, and there's people vote on what they see, they vote on what's affecting them in their lives. They have all sorts of different motivations for why they do and do not vote. What do you make of that divide, let's say, that Rhonda kind of points out between the cities and rural Saskatchewan?
Yeah, this is something we're seeing really across the country. This is by no means unique to Saskatchewan. We see it in, of course, Alberta, but over in Ontario as well, that people in rural areas tend to vote more conservative. And people in urban areas tend to vote for centrist or center-left parties, be that the NDP and the Saskatchewan Party, or perhaps if we're on Ontario, a mix of the NDP and the Liberals. My instinct, and I'm always very careful to kind of dismiss this as an effect as a result of education. We do know that education matters to vote choice, but I also think there are interests in play, and parties respond and cater to different interests. And that may be affecting some of this divide. So if you take something kind of off the top of my head, something like environmental issues, the way that environmental issues are handled will affect people in cities and rural areas differently. If you live in a city, it's easier for you to avoid, say, the impact of a carbon tax because you can walk to places, there are public transit systems available. That might not be the case if you're living in a rural area. And so that might map on to people's decision to choose to vote for a more left-leaning party that might be supportive of more action on climate change, or a more right-leaning party that may be less supportive of those sorts of things. And there's a range of other issues that I think we could talk about like that, where I think increasingly center-right parties are taking views and positions that align with the interests of more rural voters, and center-left parties are taking views that may align more with the interests of more urban voters, and that I think contributes to the split that we see. So be very, very careful to not to kind of just jot this down to education. I think there are very real differences in the policies that parties are offering that provide different benefits to people in urban and rural areas.
We have an email from Ken. This is another sort of focused on voting patterns and why people decide to vote. And he says, I try to understand how rural voters favor one party, regardless of how the party governs. Bill Boyd practices were questionable, yet that didn't impact how constituents voted once he left. How can things change? I think this speaks to something we have talked about, and that Eric touched on as well, is people, being, let's say, loyal to the brand, or if they're a Sask Party supporter and they live in this case in Bill Boyd's constituency of Kindersley, they're happy with the party, they're going to vote for the party versus maybe the individual. As I said, of course, there's all sorts of different motivations for voting. We talked about the map here in Saskatchewan and the fact that the Saskatchewan Party can sweep the rural seats and still form government. How does that affect the campaign, the way you look at it, Daniel, as far as the messaging you're expecting to see, and where candidates may decide to go, and the two main parties may decide to focus their time?
Yeah, I would expect a lot of campaigning in suburban areas. Those kind of ridings that are just on the edge of Saskatoon and Regina that are going to be quite competitive, and probably some campaigning in Prince Albert and Moose Jaw where there's some competitive ridings. The reality of a single-member plurality or a first-past-the-post electoral system is it creates a strong incentive for parties not really to campaign in ridings where they're fairly comfortable, and not to campaign in ridings where they know they're unlikely to win. So this is going to push both the Sask Party and the NDP away from campaigning in rural areas. The Sask Party is going to say, we're probably going to win in the rural areas regardless of whether we do a lot of campaigning here, so we're not going to put a lot of resources there. The NDP is going to say we're probably not going to win rural areas. I would be surprised if they put a lot of resources there. And similar kind of reverse dynamic will happen in kind of Newtana and the center of Regina and Saskatoon, which kind of leaves a lot of campaigning effort focused on kind of those suburban ridings that might switch between the Sask Party and the NDP, and those handful of ridings in Prince Albert and Moose Jaw that if the NDP is competitive in, or if the NDP is competitive in the province, those ridings could be in play. So single-member plurality system, the electoral system we have, will drive campaigning towards competitive ridings and away from ridings that aren't all that close.
I talked with Eric about, third parties in the province. We know it's, mostly going to be a two-party race here, but as the Lumsden Morris by-election showed, the Saskatchewan United Party kind of made a debut there and made a bit of a splash, and they're definitely, advertising. Their leader is out there campaigning, and we have the Buffalo Party and others that are also intending to have a say, the Green Party, the PCs, and some with some candidates running. What can we read into, if anything, the impact of some of these parties when we talk about polling? We talked about it with Eric, and that it's so hard to tell what kind of support they may have.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know from any polling data. I will say we've been waiting now, I think, 5 or 6 years for one of these small far-right parties, either at the federal level, the PPC, or at the provincial level, the Buffalo Party here, the New Blue Party in Ontario. We've been waiting for one of those parties to make a breakthrough. And for the most part, it really hasn't happened. And so for me, I kind of need to see it happen before I believe it. I need to see something like the Sask United Party really get competitive and look competitive in some polls, look competitive in an election, before I start to believe that this is a real threat. The one example I can think of would have been in the most recent Quebec election, where the Conservative Party of Quebec, which is oddly enough the party to the right of the mainstream right party in Quebec, the Coalition Avenir Quebec, did win a substantial share of the vote, but they didn't win any seats because that was all, they won most of their vote in places where the Coalition Avenir Quebec was already quite strong. My instinct is if the Sask United Party does win substantial shares of the vote, that we'll see something quite similar, that it'll be a party that may pick up significant shares of the vote in rural Saskatchewan, but those are ridings the Sask Party's going to win by quite a substantial margin anyways. And so you can never say that a party's never going to have an effect, but I need to see a lot more evidence before I believe that the Sask United Party is going to shape what the results of this election are going to be.
It's interesting because, there was some speculation that maybe this Sask United Party and some of the other third parties, as we talked about, would only run in certain areas where they can make an impact. But I know that the United Party, for example, has named some candidates in the city centres, also in Rosser and Shellbrook against the Premier. We have a caller here from Meadow Lake. It's Linda on the line. Hi, Linda.
Hi. I'm just wanting to just ask about the Angus Reid poll. I am one of the people that gets polled every once in a while, and it's mainly Angus Reid. And I find, not just with politics, but with other issues as well, there seems to be somewhat of a bias, or maybe just not asking the right questions. Do other people ever talk about that or complain about that?
I'll just quickly from what I know, what I experience of talking to people on the poll, the complaint I get is some people that are in the forum but don't get called or they don't get asked, and so
right.
they're wondering, why am I not asked? And there are questions about, I guess, the phrasing of the questions or how that's done. Daniel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I don't work for Angus Reid, so I don't know exactly how they're doing things. What I will say from an academic perspective is, if the pollster is doing what they should be doing, they should be contacting people at random in there. They've got like a panel or a group of people that they'll regularly call, and they pick random samples every time of that group every time they want to do a poll. And that means sometimes if people aren't going to get called. And sometimes people don't realize how much, randomness could mean they're just left out for random reasons. The second thing is we know in academia that question wording is very important. And that you can and often just accidentally, bias responses in a particular direction if you're not careful with the way you order questions and the way that you ask questions. I don't know what Angus Reid is doing with their particular questions. I don't know what Insitrix is doing with their particular questions. So I can't say whether in these particular polls, question wording or question order is leading to the different results, but it is a plausible explanation for why two polls might get different results. If they ask a question slightly differently, or if they just ask a question that leads people to think of, like a question before they ask the who are you going to vote for a question that leads people to think of themselves in a particular way, that could change the way that people answer a poll. If you've got a poll that asks a lot of questions about the teacher strike and then asks questions about who somebody's going to vote for, that poll is going to get a different result than if you ask people a bunch of questions about the economy and then ask them who they're going to vote for. The fact that you've primed voters to think about particular issues will change the way that they respond to questions. I don't know if that's what's going on. I don't think the polls would make that serious a mistake in these cases, but question wording and question order absolutely matter.
Linda, hopefully that answers your question. We have a call. We have a call from Clem in Saskatoon. Hi there, Clem.
Hi, Adam and guest. Kind of late, but I'm just wondering, why did the NDP fall out of favor in the 90s? They used to be government, and then what happened to them? Was it because they cut rural health care, or what was it? And I'll just hang up and listen. Thanks.
And Daniel, you're smiling. I can see you on my screen here. I'm smiling as well. That's a complicated question. I think, in fairness to our guests and myself, it's a tough one to answer. But I know that to maybe rephrase, we still get, and covering the legislature, Daniel, we still get the Saskatchewan Party campaigning and also revisiting the 90s and the early 2000s NDP. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, you could write a book about this question, and I don't know that I've got the data to do that, but I've been thinking about it. What I would say is I think we sometimes get this one a little bit backwards. To me, the question is not why the Sask Party is successful today in Saskatchewan. It's why the NDP was successful in the past. If we look at Saskatchewan today, it is a rural province compared to the provinces around it. It is a well-off province, second or third GDP per capita, and is a very resource-based province, right? An economy that's based on potash, natural gas, those types of things. If I knew nothing about the history of a particular province and you told me those three things about a province, I would say that's a conservative province. And so I look at those things. I think it kind of makes sense that the Sask Party does well here, given that conservative parties do better in rural areas, they do better in places where people are better off, and they do better in resource economies because they have an advantage on questions around resources versus climate change, that particular issue. So I don't think the rise of the Sask Party is puzzling. I think what is interesting is why we go from the NDP being successful perhaps in a province, or to being more successful perhaps in Saskatchewan than we might have expected, to a province that now looks like you'd expect it to, given the demographics and the state of the economy in the province.
Daniel, we're going to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time today and all your expertise. Of course, we really appreciate it once again here on Blue Sky. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. That's Daniel Westlake, an assistant professor of political studies at the University of Saskatchewan. And as the provincial affairs reporter, as my regular job here at CBC, I could geek out and nerd out on political talk for the entire hour and increasingly for another show. But we've run out of time today on the show. Thank you to our guest, Eric Grenier from the RIT. Definitely check out his work. He does incredible work there. And as I mentioned, I'll be appearing on his podcast and his video in a couple of days talking about the Saskatchewan election. So if you want to hear more of our conversation and dig a little bit deeper into this, definitely go check it out there. Also, Daniel Westlake from the University of Saskatchewan, assistant professor of political studies, was our guest. Thank you, callers and emailers who joined in on the conversation today. We always appreciated the show runs because of you.